Hello, and welcome to HHH, the podcast where we talk about those horrible humans in history. I am your host, Angela Pearson, and thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so excited to have you here. If you're brand new, welcome. We're so glad to have you because we love talking about these horrible humans, and we're so glad that you're joining us on this journey. If you have been with me from the beginning, thank you so much for your support. I really appreciate it. And if you are really enjoying this podcast, make sure you're sharing it with other people so we can just continue to make it grow, so it makes it more fun to share these stories with as many people as possible. And also make sure you're liking and subscribing to the channel. Make sure you turn on the notifications so you get notified every time we upload a new episode. It should be every Thursday. But just in case, if you have been with me long enough, you know that sometimes that does not happen. So make sure you turn on those notifications so you know when a new video, you wish, episode recording is uploaded. So anyways, if you have any suggestions for me about the podcast, if you want to hear about a specific horrible human in history, please let me know. I love talking about who you guys want to talk about. In fact, today's episode, huge shout out to Ethan Ackerman. I said it correctly. Thank you, Ethan, for correcting me. I prefer to say things correctly. I'm just not good at it. So, Ethan Ackerman, thank you so much for the recommendation today. He recommended the subject of today's episode, and you can do the same. Just make sure you comment on either this episode or you can comment on something on my Facebook or Instagram, or just send me a private message on either of those platforms. So that would be wonderful because, again, I like to talk about who you want to hear about. So it's time we actually dive into today's topic. And trust me, this one's a lot. So it's going to be fascinating to learn about this subject. So we're entering a world of one of America's most prolific serial killers. I know I say that almost about every single one of the serial killers, but they're pretty bad, guys. Let me tell you. Today, we are going to be talking about a man whose crimes spanned decades, a man investigators chased for nearly 20 years, just didn't quite have enough evidence to arrest him for 20 years, and a man who hid behind an utterly just ordinary life to hide what he was doing. Today, we are talking about Gary Ridgway, better known as the Green River Killer. Now, Gary Ridgway murdered at least 49 women, though he claimed that the number was closer to around 71 or more. His targets were overwhelmingly vulnerable women, shocker, runaways, sex workers, women living on the fringes of society, which made them really easy target, which we've learned about in some of our other episodes, because they were isolated and he would abduct them and ultimately kill them. Ridgway would dump many of his bodies, or the victims' bodies, along the Green River, hence the Green River Killer, in Washington. So that's how he got his nickname. And for nearly 2 decades, the Green River Killer was terrifyingly mysterious. No one knew who he was until a breakthrough in DNA evidence finally cracked the code. So how did a quiet, mild-mannered truck painter, yeah, that was his job, become one of the most prolific serial killers in American history? Well, my friends, it is time to unpack that story. So let's dive in. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18th, 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah. Ugh, guys, makes me cringe. That's where I was born. Oh, man, I promise we're not all bad ducks like this man. Anyways, he was the middle child in a family of 3 boys. His parents were Thomas and Mary Ridgway. Thomas worked as a bus driver and Mary was a sales clerk. In the 1960s, his family actually moved from Salt Lake City, so he wasn't really a Salt Lake Cityite for very long. So I take a little solace in that. Anyways, he moved from Salt Lake City to Washington State, where he would stay and commit most of his crimes in that state. So now on the surface, the Ridgways weren't especially unusual. They were just kind of your normal working class family. They lived in a working class neighborhood. They moved around a little bit and seemed to be your average American family. But inside the home, things were actually pretty tense. Gary later described his mother as very domineering and sometimes physically aggressive. Not necessarily abusive in the traditional sense, but really intense, like very overbearing and prone to sudden anger. At times, Gary seemed to really hold a strange, uncomfortable fascination with her, which we'll talk about in a second. In one documentary that I watched about him, it said that Gary, up until the age 13, had a severe bedwetting problem, and apparently his mother would help him wipe down his no-no zone up until the age of 13. Now, that's a little bit odd and could possibly explain the special feelings, if you know, you know, that he had for his mom. And he actually admitted to a psychologist that he had these lustful feelings for her for quite some time. Even though it seems like she may have been pretty mentally and emotionally abusive to him, he still had this fascination with her. He described other moments that blurred lines between maternal care with something super unsettling, like bathing him as an older child, being physically close in ways that confused him. So if that tells you anything about the kind of physical closeness. And all of this, like I said, would lead to him having this really misguided, better yet, twisted thoughts and feelings about sexuality. So all of these experiences with his mother really shaped him deeply. Gary struggled academically and was actually held back 2 grades. Testing later would show that he had an IQ around 82, so he was below average, and he felt pretty lost in school. That was not a place where he was thriving, clearly. School is not built for him, basically. He was bullied, which he eventually learned to protect himself from these bullies at school. He would have to act very violently, and then the bullies would leave him alone. So he actually started acting out pretty violently, mostly to protect himself, but then it just escalated from there. He felt very inadequate and struggled socially from a very, very early age. He basically didn't make any friends, and he was always the odd one out when it came to school or friendships or anything like that. And then during his teen years, you kind of start to see the first flashes of darkness in him. What we often call the early indicators in criminology. So here's some of these early indicators. At age 16, Ridgway actually stabbed a 6-year-old boy in the liver because he just wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone. And afterwards, after he stabbed this child, he walked away like nothing happened, just to appease his morbid curiosity. I will say the boy did survive, but the incident wasn't ever properly addressed. Like, he never faced basically any consequences for these choices. The choice to stab someone. So Meanwhile, Gary actually developed an obsession with women, which is not shocking given that he was already obsessed with his mother. And this was not a healthy interest in women because, in your teenage years, you start wanting to date and you're interested in people and you're wanting to, start dating and having those kinds of experiences. That is not the case in this instant. It was a very unhealthy interest in women. His earliest girlfriends recalled he swung between neediness, like really just clingy, needing, to the control and being very rigid with them and trying to control every aspect of them. He really struggled with religious guilt, and he had a sexual fixation. And by sexual fixation, he was obsessed. It was more than a fixation. It was like an obsession. He wanted it all the time, no matter where, no matter when. I personally, from my experience, my background in psychology, I would almost say that he had a sex addiction at this point. But he had very, very low self-worth. And this cocktail of the guilt and like the religious guilt, the sexual fixation and the low self-worth, all of that fed into the pathology behind his crimes. So it just kind of fueled that flame that would later turn into the explosion that he was. So anyways, after high school, in 1969, Ridgway actually joined the Navy and got married. Yes, he got married. I do want to point out, though, that when he was married, his mother was still heavily involved in his relationship and in his life, literally buying him clothing and deciding what he should wear every day. That's how involved his mother was. Now, I will say, if I had a mother-in-law like that, the marriage would not last super long. Not at all. That's a little overbearing. That's actually a little cuckoo crazy. So if I have any listeners out there that do this with your son, no offense, but you should stop. I doubt that because all my listeners are phenomenal. So, but spoiler alert, this does actually cause their marriage to end, but we'll get there. After he was married, he served in Vietnam. So he was married and in the military, and he got called to Vietnam. His time overseas spiraled into heavy use of sex workers, like a ridiculous amount of sex workers. And because of this, he caught several venereal diseases, and he actually blamed the workers and the women and just like women in general for getting these diseases. Yeah, he didn't take any accountability that he was, actively going to see these women and there was a possibility he could contract these things. No. It was all their fault, and he blamed all women for this disease he got. And this would actually fuel the already existing emotional disconnect that he felt specifically towards women. So he was already seeing women as objects, and this actually made it worse. So when he returned home, this part's actually ironic, I guess you could say. When he got home, he actually found out that his wife had been dating another man while he was away. Shocker. That's actually, you know what? Good for her. Good for her. She got out of something more dangerous than she could have imagined. So anyways, they divorced in 1972, but he was married a year later in 1973 to his next wife. Strangely, it was at this point in time he developed a new way to release his frustration with women. And I know what you're thinking. And no, it's not when he starts killing his victims. I know. I built it up to make it sound like that's when it was going to start happening. It's not. I'm sorry. I'm letting you down. And I found this very interesting, and you're not going to guess what happened. This blew my mind because I thought this was when he was going to start killing his victims. Like I said, it's not. This was the plot twist that I did not see coming at this point in time because he wanted to figure things out. He basically becomes a religious zealot, aka a Bible thumper, preaching out of the Bible. This was his way of trying to cure the sex maniac inside of him, but unfortunately, it actually didn't work. Shocker. He became more of a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde kind of personality where on the surface, he was preaching and really showing how religious he was. But on the backside, he was still addicted to sex. He still was needing those urges to be fulfilled. And at this point in time, while he's being super religious, him and his wife actually had a son. And to everyone else appeared to be the good old-fashioned traditional religious family. But in 1981, his second marriage actually would come to an end because of his mother's presence again. So it wasn't because of his sexual addiction. It was because of his mother both times. And just the minor detail of him going to see prostitutes on a never-ending basis wasn't the big issue. It was the mother. So that shows you how horrible this mother-in-law has to be, right? Because, I'm sorry, if you're going to see prostitutes, that would be a deal breaker for me personally. But, it was the mother-in-law that caused the marriage to break up. So in 1982, he ran into problems with the law for the very first time when he was caught soliciting a prostitute. So that was the first encounter he had with law enforcement, first time he broke the law. He would never be successful in a marriage. He wanted women, but he really resented them. He needed the companionship, but punished it. And he was outwardly polite, quiet, and almost invisible. So he just such an ordinary guy. He almost blended into the background. But internally, he was full of resentment, desire, and rage. So he began picking up more and more and more sex workers to try and satisfy his unsatisfiable lust. And soon the monster deep inside of him was just about to burst, fly out of the cage that he had been trying to push it into. So his first murders began in 1982 when Ridgway was in his early 30s. He was living in Washington, working at a truck painting job that he would keep for decades. He was at this job basically until he was at this job until he got caught. Not basically, he was at this job until he got caught. So his first confirmed victim, which is so heartbreaking, was a 16-year-old young woman who had gotten involved in sex work because she had run away from home. I saw an interview of her sister, and this poor girl had a really toxic relationship at home with her stepfather where he was abusing her, in the sexual way. And so she was trying to escape that. So she ran away when she was 15. I think she turned 16 while she was away from home. And she was using sex work to pay for herself because she was trying to escape that. And this was his first victim. He picked her up off of the Strip, so the Pacific Highway South in Seattle, Washington. And he was just on his way home from his job. And like all of Ridgway's victims, he would approach them with a very friendly demeanor, offering a ride or a safe place to stay. And like I said, he comes across as a very unassuming person, literally could blend into the background. So obviously they're going to think he's totally fine. Like many of the survivors actually recall that he seemed almost awkward and certainly not threatening at all, which to me personally means he's even scarier because you literally can't sense the monster lurking under the surface of this kind person. He took her to a desolate location near the Green River, just outside the city limits. But once he was alone with this girl, he would attack. So on July 15th, 1982 is when his first victim's body was found. The police believe she had been murdered a week before she was actually found. So it took them a week to actually find her. And again, he purposely targeted these sex workers because he knew that no one would be worried that they were missing. Obviously, there was family out there missing them and worried about them, but because a lot of them were runaways and just trying to struggle through life, they didn't necessarily have people actively looking for them. So that's why it took a week to find her. Not that her family didn't care, but they didn't know. So, anyways, so the police believed that she'd been killed a week before, and after that, after this first murder, like I said, this monster came bursting out of his cage because he went on a killing spree, killing more than 5 young women in 5 weeks. So he went from not killing anyone to basically killing one person per week. So by August of 1982, he already had 6 victims. Like I said, ripping, roaring out of his monster cage. Now, this reminds me of a quote from a very wise Ron Burgundy, well, that escalated quickly. Yeah, that's how I felt when I read that he killed one person and suddenly just one every week. And his actions would just continue to escalate. So, Ridgway had the same modus operandi when it came to his victims, aka he did the same thing every single time to every victim. He would strangle his victims. At first, he actually used his hands, but when his victims actually started fighting back and causing injuries like bruises or scratches on his arms or face or anything, he didn't want to have to explain his injuries to his friends. Like he knew they would see his arms and be like, dude, where'd you get those bruises? He didn't want to have to explain any of that. So he turned to using ligatures like ropes, usually a rope. So he would dump their bodies in the wooded area near the Green River. Notice I didn't say he dumped them into the river. That's important because he would eventually dump their bodies into the river because that was a great way to clean off evidence. That's partially why the police had such a hard time finding who this person was. But there was another reason he didn't initially put them into the water. He would often return later to engage in disturbing acts with his victims. Yeah. He often would pose the bodies, or he left them in clusters. He liked to leave quite a few bodies in one place before he would move on to another place to leave the bodies. This became one of the ways the investigators were actually able to connect him to all his crimes, because he continued to do these same things every single time he would commit a murder. Now, throughout the early 1980s, young women began disappearing from Seattle and Tacoma areas at a very alarming rate. Their disappearances didn't immediately register as connected, mostly because, like I said, these women were in marginalized groups. Most of them were very, very young. Like I said, runaways, teenagers, very young prostitutes who had run away from home. And that meant they didn't get reported missing right away. That's just what happened. And it's unfortunate because they all had loved ones that cared about them that would have noticed if they hadn't been runaways. But soon, investigators started noticing those patterns. Bodies turned up near the same stretches of road and the same riverbanks in the similar state of undress. So they started realizing, okay, this is the same person. And by 1983, the term Green River Killer actually started circulating publicly. So people started to know there's a serial killer out there. And it seems like investigators can't seem to catch a break with this case because Ridgway continued killing, sometimes up to multiple women in 1 week. Like I said, he ramped it up and then he ramped it up even more. So he was a man juggling marriages, jobs, church activities, and serial murder. Because who doesn't have that on their to-do list, right? Friends saw him as very quiet. His coworkers found him super normal, and he blended in perfectly. So it was really hard for investigators to really track him down. Now, in May of 1983, Ridgway changed what he did, but only for one victim. So on May 3rd, 1983, the victim was Carol Ann Christiansen. She was actually working as a waitress at a tavern/bar near the airport area. She had been married at one point and actually had a daughter. So already, this victim is completely different than all the other victims that he has selected. This is the first time he's actually picked someone who seemed to be on the right track with their life, or at least have it somewhat together, you know. Now, her body was discovered in 1983 in Maple Valley, Washington, in a wooded area. She was strangled to death. They found evidence of the person who was there with her that was later matched to Ridgway. And when they found her body, she was clothed. Investigators noted strange staging. So this was what was really weird about this. He actually staged her body. He put a bag over her head. He put 2 fish placed on top of her body. Fish. I don't know. It gets weirder. There was a bottle of wine that they found dumped on her. There was ground sausage in both of her hands. Ground sausage? Yeah. And other disturbing ritualistic details about her body. Now, investigators made sure that they reclothed her correctly because one shoe was on the wrong foot. Another, I think it was a sock or something was missing. Like, she just wasn't clothed correctly, so they re-put her clothes on correctly. She's, like I said, notable because she did not fit the prostitute or runaway teen profile that was very common among his victims. She was a working waitress mother and, like I said, somewhat stable lifestyle. And her murder showed that Ridgway sometimes targeted women outside of the stereotype quote-unquote high-risk group, making him even more unpredictable and even more dangerous than they thought. And another thing that's interesting about this is later Ridgway actually admitted to weeping after killing Carol Ann. Like, he said he felt guilty. After he had staged her body, he sat down next to her and just wept, which is really interesting that he felt only guilty about her murder. So it's like he didn't feel guilty about a specific demographic, but he did feel guilty about another demographic. It's just very weird. And I know you can't really make a serial killer make sense. Like, none of what they ever do makes sense, but that I can't figure out how their brains work. And that's why I like talking about them, is because I'm really trying to figure out how their brains work. And it's not working. I just can't. Now, I guess you could say one good thing did come out of this murder. I mean, good, I get, quote unquote, good. It is good, but not, it's never good when someone dies. But the good thing that came out of this was that because her death was linked to Ridgway via forensic science, it was a DNA match later, her case actually helped solidify the scope of his crimes beyond the sex work serial killer narrative. So because of what he did to her, it actually led to being able to solidify the case against him and bring him to justice. So I guess that's the good that came out of this, I guess you could say. Now, Ridgway actually came into contact with police multiple times during the investigation, but nothing would stick. They could never get enough evidence on him. When the Green River Task Force began investigating the growing cluster of missing women, Ridgway was identified pretty early as someone that they wanted to look at. He'd been seen with sex workers, and his truck actually matched some descriptions. I watched where they were talking about a daughter that had gone missing, and she had been a sex worker. Her boyfriend had been her pimp, basically. And he watched her get in the car with Ridgway. And he said he just had this gut feeling that something was not right about the situation. So he decided to follow the truck. So he was following Ridgway, but eventually got stuck at a light. So he couldn't continue to follow them. And he lost track of them. And his girlfriend never showed up that night, never showed up the next morning. And so the police were able to, identify the truck. They were able to find the truck. And they questioned Ridgway, but they didn't see him as a threat. They thought there must have been a mistake. Yeah. Don't you love when they just get so close and could have saved so many lives and just didn't? So, anyways, he was one of their main topics. So, like I said, witnesses had seen a man in a pickup truck with one of the victims right before she disappeared. Kind of the story I just told you. And since Ridgway had a similar truck and sometimes cruised that area for workers, he was for sure top on their list. But when the detectives approached him, he was very calm. He was polite. He was cooperative. He always denied everything and presented himself as this mild-mannered, religious, family-oriented guy. He gave them absolutely nothing to work with. And this next part is one of the biggest missed opportunities in the entire case. So in 1984, Ridgway actually agreed to take a lie detector test. This is how sure they were that he had something to do with it, that they brought him in for a lie detector test. But somehow, he passed the lie detector test, or at least, quote unquote, passed enough that they didn't really pressure him much harder because he passed this lie detector test. This was partially because he had a very flat emotional range, as a lot of psychopaths do. So he never really showed a lot of anxiety. Like, he showed basically none being around the police. Even when he was lying, he showed none. And polygraphs are notoriously unreliable. I don't even know if they're admissible in court. A lot of times, I'm making that up. Don't quote me on that. But I feel like they're so unreliable, especially with psychopaths or emotionally blunt individuals, because their affect never changes. So the polygraph result caused the police to actually drop him down pretty far on the suspect list. And this decision obviously led to him being able to kill even more women. Now, in 1987, detectives came back around to him and obtained a search warrant for his home and vehicle. So it took him a while to get to the police's attention. They actually collected carpet fibers, rope pieces of cord, paint samples, pornography, photographs. It's because I said pornography. That's why. Photographies. Photos. Jeez. And DNA samples, which included saliva. Now, this was evidence that would eventually catch him, but the technology at the time wasn't advanced enough to use it. They just collected it. The DNA denigration and early techniques couldn't link Ridgway to the victims yet. So he walked free again. Now, Ridgway did something super chilling. He actually tried to help the police catch the Green River killer. Yeah, while he was the killer himself. Now, a lot of killers try and get really close to the investigation to see how it's going and to kind of like internally gloat to themselves that like, look at me, I'm getting away with it. I am so smart. This is proving how smart I am. So this is kind of what he's doing right now. He spoke with the detectives about how difficult it must be to track the killer, how he believed the killer really hated women, which he already knew the killer did, and his quote-unquote theories about the dump sites. Yeah, this was a manipulative technique that, like I said, many serial killers use to feel in control of the situation. He also kept scrapbooks of the Green River Killer media coverage. Yeah. He adjusted his methods when he learned what the police knew. Like, for example, when they collected the carpet fibers, he went through and replaced all of his carpets so none of the fibers would match anymore. Yeah, he paid attention to all the roadblocks and the stakeouts that the police were doing in the areas and avoided them. He was always watching the investigation. So, like I said, not surprising, most serial killers really like to get this credit for their work and love feeling superior and like, I'm so smart. So this is not surprising at all. What makes his police interaction so disturbing, though, is he was interviewed multiple times, and got away. He passed that polygraph test. He quietly observed the investigation, so he had insider information and he knew how to avoid getting arrested. And he did it for nearly 2 decades, despite the fact that he was on the suspect list basically the whole time. Even like in one of the documentaries, one of the investigators was talking and he said, I literally went up to him and was like, I know you did this and I'm going to get you. Like, he knew, but they could not get enough evidence to convict him. So by the 1990s, the killings had actually slowed down pretty dramatically. The police had fewer fresh leads and basically were dealing with cold cases at this point. But I'm sure you're asking yourself, why? Why would he suddenly slow down in his killings? Well, it's actually a pretty simple answer. He met a girl. He got married again. So Gary Ridgway met Judith Mawson around 1985. through a single parents group because Gary, remember, is a single father at this point, which is super weird to think about a serial killer, being a daddy. Anyways, Judith was coming out of a very difficult marriage and found Gary he was very quiet and stable and super dependable, which was exactly the opposite of the chaos that she had been experiencing in her previous marriage. So she once said she thought she had finally found a quote-unquote good man. Oh, poor Judith. She had no idea the monster that she married. Like, my heart genuinely goes out to her because dating is hard, especially in your 30s and stuff. It is hard. So my heart goes out to her because I'm sure she was just like, I can't let this one slip away. He's so amazing. And little did she know, he's way worse than any other man could have possibly been. So their relationship felt so stable because Judith described Ridgway as very kind and soft-spoken and very helpful around the house. He was attentive to her, reliable with money, and a quote-unquote clean freak, and a man who actually seemed to enjoy domestic life. Now, knowing what we know about him, she didn't know anything about him. He seems like such a great guy. What a catch, right? She thought he was a very hardworking man. He never missed work as a truck painter. Yeah, never missed work. He was devoted. He was looking for peace and routine. And I scoffed at this one. He was nonviolent and apparently a really great liar. And he never showed any signs of aggression or cruelty towards her. So it's always interesting to me when serial killers can have such a normal, respectful, loving relationship while they're out murdering people. Like, they can see their spouse as someone worth caring about and loving and would do anything for, but then they just see these other women as objects that they can do with whatever they want. It's just, again, been trying to understand their brains. I can't. It makes no sense to me. So they married in 1988. And for Judith, this was the happiest, most stable period of her life. She said she genuinely believed that Gary had rescued her from the loneliness and instability. Poor woman. Like, literally, my heart breaks for her. And this is the time period where the murders really started to drastically decline. She described their life. Their home life was very peaceful, routine, loving, full of projects, dinners, small vacation, church activities. She believed that she had found her soulmate, and he presented himself as very shy and dependable and just wanted this simple life with her. And she said she had no idea who he really was and often blames herself for missing signs, even though Ridgway was a master deceiver. There was no way that she could have possibly known what he was actually doing. Now, why did their relationship matter to the case? So to investigators, Judith represented how normal Ridgway could appear, how easily he actually compartmentalized his life. Like, I am a good person here, and then over here I'm doing these horrible, awful things, but I can separate them. And how his stable marriage actually gave him camouflage, and he manipulated sympathy to stay undetected. Like, I'm just a married man. Like, I'm just a normal dude. And she confirmed something that criminologists often see in quote-unquote invisible serial killers. A stable home life can make them blend in even more successfully because he lived a quiet, suburban life, was married, and worked his stable truck painting job. Remember, he's had this job for a long time. He went to church, he volunteered, and appeared to be just as normal as anyone could possibly be. And so, again, he slipped off law enforcement's radar. For nearly 2 decades, investigators built files, ran tests, followed dead ends, but everything changed in 2001, nearly 20 years after the first Green River victims were found. Improved DNA technology was the game changer. That's what sealed his fate. It allowed analysis to test evidence collected in the early 1980s from his victims, evidence that had been carefully stored but previously unusable. So it's like they knew, I'm sure they knew that technology would eventually catch up to the evidence. So I'm glad that they collected all of that. And suddenly, the dam broke. DNA linked Ridgway to 4 victims starting off. It was Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, Carol Christensen, and Cynthia Hines. With forensic evidence, plus witness accounts and behavioral patterns, police finally had enough to arrest him. So, on November 30th, 2001, Gary Ridgway was arrested outside the truck factory where he had worked for so long. Coworkers watched in shock. This quiet, dependable man in his 50s was the Green River killer. They could not believe it. There was no way. When confronted, Ridgway first denied everything, but as he saw the evidence mounting against him, he quickly changed tactics. He confessed, but he did it strategically. So, Ridgway agreed to lead investigators to more victims in exchange for taking the death penalty off the table. His detailed confessions finally gave families answers they'd been waiting decades for. Judith, the poor woman, was shocked. After his arrest and confessions, Ridgway went out of his way to keep his family, quote-unquote, family life separate from his crimes. So she had no idea. He hid things by committing murders while Judith was at work. He dumped the bodies on his way home from work. He kept his quote-unquote, kill kit in his truck, not in the home, using his job as a truck painter to explain irregular hours. So if he was working late or something, yeah, he wasn't. And being extremely, quote unquote, normal at home helped to hide what he was doing. Judith said she never once suspected him at all because he didn't disappear for long stretches of time. He wasn't moody or erratic. He had no violent behavior at home, and he didn't keep any kind of trophies or anything. And he acted loving and calm at all times around her. So she had no clue. And Ridgway even said later that being married to her actually reduced his urge to kill. And his murder rate during the early years of their relationship actually really did slow down because of that. In a 2007 television interview, though, Judith said, "I feel I have saved lives by being his wife and making him happy." Which I think in a lot of ways, I think she's right. But she had no idea while they were married what he was doing. Without her knowledge, you know. But I think her loving him and him feeling secure in that relationship, at least at first, it made him feel valued probably for the first time in his life. If you think about it, he had genuine love from someone that just wanted love from him. So it's interesting. I think she did save lives because his murders went down, but she had no idea she was saving lives at the time. Now, when Ridgway was arrested in 2001, Judith at first obviously believed it was a mistake, but investigators told her that they actually had DNA evidence and she collapsed, which I don't blame her at all. She filed for divorce pretty shortly after, and like I said, I genuinely feel for her. I feel so bad for her. She thought she found the perfect guy. And in interviews, she said that the realization destroyed her entire sense of reality. Can you imagine? Like, she believed she had truly known him, and yet she had lived beside a serial killer for over a decade. Like, sharing the same bed, sharing a life with this person. Oh, it hurts my soul for her. Now, during interviews with detectives, Ridgway spoke very calmly, almost emotionless in his manners. He described the murders as if he were describing his normal work routine. He referred to victims by general categories, not ever by name. Detective noted that he often minimized his actions, which, not surprising, blamed the victims. Yeah, you heard that right. He blamed the victims for the victims getting murdered. What a joke. I mean, that is psychopathic behavior, so it does make sense. He acted confused about details he didn't want to admit, and he never showed real remorse for what he did. He eventually confessed to 48 murders in a plea agreement, but based on his own confessions, he claimed, quote, "I killed so many women, I can't remember," unquote. His actual count could be over 70 and maybe even closer to 90. He himself admitted he targeted sex workers because he thought, quote, "no one would miss them." What? Oh, gosh. That chilling calculation defined his crime spree. Now, in 2003, Ridgway pled guilty to the 48 counts of aggravated murder, the largest serial killer plea deal in U.S. history at the time. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Actually, it was multiple life sentences stacked one on top of the other, ensuring that he for sure would die behind bars. Which, I still believe in capital punishment. If you kill someone, kill multiple people like this, Anyways, that's my personal opinion, but he's got a life sentence and he will for sure die behind bars. During the sentencing, the families actually confronted him directly, and he just stared blankly at many of them, except for one. A father got up who said he forgave him for what he did. That single moment broke Ridgway's stoic facade. He cried briefly before retreating back into silence, which I find super interesting. He showed no emotion when people were telling about how their actions, like how his actions affected them and their family and all of that. But when he got forgiven, an action that affected him, he got emotional. And when one of the victim's sisters saw this in her interview, she said that she was so pissed. She was so mad that he cried at that moment, but didn't cry when people were saying how heartbroken they were that they lost their loved ones. Like, I don't blame her. Now, Gary Ridgway is still alive. He's incarcerated at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, Washington. He lives a quiet life, occasionally cooperating with authorities when new remains or unidentified victims are discovered. How kind of him. He has expressed almost no genuine remorse, shocker, apart from the one sentencing moment where he got emotional. He continues to insist that he, quote, only killed prostitutes, as if that somehow lessens the horror of what he did. His case remains a brutal reminder of how invisible people and invisible evil can operate, and how society's neglect of vulnerable women create an open basically open door for this predator to attack. Now, Ridgway was not a genius. He wasn't charismatic. He wasn't cunning or highly educated. He was ordinary, almost boringly so. And that is what makes him so terrifying. He hid behind normalcy, behind a job, a marriage, church groups, cookouts, neighborhood routines. Meanwhile, dozens of families never saw their daughters come home again. There's a lingering question in every case like this. How did he get away with it for so long? Especially because he was on their suspect list for so dang long. And the answer almost always comes down to one thing. Society did not value the women he targeted. Unfortunately, they were almost as invisible as he was. His victims mattered. Their lives mattered. And Ridgway chose them because he thought no one cared. But we all care. That's how I feel about all the victims on all of my shows, just to be clear. That's why learning about this is important, is because their lives mattered. So, thank you so much for listening to this episode of Horrible Humans in History. If you like today's episode, make sure you like, subscribe. Make sure you're sharing this with other people that enjoy true crime and history. Also, make sure you send me any horrible humans that you would like to hear about, because I want to talk about who you want to hear about. So join me next week as we talk about, I'm going to butcher her name, Queen Rana. I even practiced this before I started talking, guys. Let's try it one more time. Queen Ranavalona. The first. I forgot the first. The blood-soaked queen of Madagascar. We'll talk about how she tried to save her people from colonization by killing half of her own people. Yeah, it sounds a little confusing, right? You'll have to tune in next week to hear the full story to figure out what I'm actually talking about. So we will see you next week on HHH. Thanks again, guys, and have a fantastic week. See ya.